pretty much everyone listening to this has been feeling in the run up to this budget, which the kindest thing we can say about it is it's a watershed moment apart from anything else. So if you've listened before, you'll know I like to start these with a quote, and this week's was: property taxes are an interaction between stamp duty, council tax, capital gains tax and inheritance tax. You don't solve that problem by just adding another wealth tax to it. And that was said by Lord Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England. And of course that pertains, as usual, to our deep dive, and I'm going to tackle some of this budget speculation head on, as we've officially reached fever pitch. But as the calendar creeps towards a new year, it's a natural time to pause and tackle the biggest challenges that keep SME property businesses from achieving true sustainable growth. For most, this boils down to two core areas: laying a bulletproof strategic plan for the next 12 months, and finally cracking the code on financial measurement and accountability. If you've ever felt lost in a sea of bookkeeping data, or if your productivity methods are falling short, it's time to switch from doing to leading and truly understand how your assets are performing. Book in on the next property business workshop with myself and Rod Turner, Thursday the 22nd of January in central London. That's at tinyurl.com/PBWNINE, and there's a link in the show notes as well. But it's time for Propenomix. America first, right? Well, some relief for European exporters of agricultural products as an executive order eased duties on coffee, tea and bananas, amongst other things. Targeted but minor relief. However, steel and aluminium 25% tariffs continue to keep pressure on manufacturers, and German PMI figures this week bore that out. This week there was also recognition, although it was quiet, that the US policies of deregulation and tax incentives are driving competitive advantage for the US, primarily at the expense of the EU and the UK. The call in the EU is, of course, for subsidies, because that's the language they understand. However, they're also calling for simplified regulations. Don't hold your breath on that one. Defence spending was in the headlines again this week, with pressure continuing for countries to match their 2% NATO targets. The UK is in the clear on this one, of course, but as we head into the G20 without Trump because of the administration's position on South Africa and the alleged genocide of white farmers, the whole of Europe knows it needs to be on the same page to be able to negotiate meaningfully at the upcoming high-level summits when and if Mr. T does turn up. The UK wants to move to a strategic tech and AI alliance, has announced some chunky numbers to be invested in AI this week. The leverage is, of course, Western collaboration against China. The ultimate summary of the economic prosperity deal, though, is, of course, that the US are better off than they were before the tariff threats, and the UK is worse off. That's not UK specific, though. It's either Trump being a master negotiator or simply a trade-off between short-term gains and long-term relationship damage between nations. The bits of detail, if you are interested, are removal of the 20% tariff on beef imports from the US. But I mean, beef in the US seems so expensive from pictures you see on social media. I don't think there's too much to be feared there. And UK food standards remain in place. US ethanol also paves the way for a duty-free quota of 1.4 billion litres, which will hurt domestic bioethanol producers. There's also been some work done in the enforced lowering of regulatory hurdles, streamlining customs and procurement processes, which, to be honest, sounds positive, but mostly positive for the US. The UK has, however, resisted pressure to remove the 2% digital services tax, and indeed, actually, I think that needs to go up, frankly. But it's also held firm on no hormone-treated beef and no chlorinated chicken. More of a bloody nose than anything, and of course the US have mostly got their way. Back to Blighty, though, the UK real-time property market. Chris Watkin delivered once more in a big week 45. Listings printed 26,100, down 1,000 on last week, as the market continues the listing slowdown towards the end of the year. The average week 45 saw 27,600 home listed, so the balance continues to redress a little, 1,500 under the average. It will be a slow process, though, and another clear out at the end of the year, followed by the usual Boxing Day action, and that'll tell us more about where we're at. But I'm happy now concluding that listing overperformance is over, and therefore will drop out the figures in about 9 to 10 months' time. That's my sense anyway. Drop out the year-on-year data, I should clarify. That's what we call base effects. My 10% more stock than a normal market ready reckoner continues to hold on the back of circa 2 years of overperformance in listings compared to historical averages, and only a couple of months of us creeping back below those averages. There have been 1.59 million homes listed this year so far, 8.2% ahead of the 9-year average, but that does include 2020, which pollutes the figures somewhat. We're really inching back towards the 2024 numbers now, week by week, having been 6 to 7% above them at various points in the year. But we're still listing more than we're selling, as always. So it's all eyes on the withdrawal rate as a general rule. We're only 1.1% ahead of the 2024 listings year to date now, but still 8.2 ahead of that historical average. So week 45 is pretty uniform over recent years, and this one was nothing special, but we did list 11.5% fewer homes than week 45 of 2024. It looks a lot like a pre-pandemic week 45, to be honest. Indeed, there's just about enough time left for it to be a close one between the 2025 and 2024 listings at the end of the year. But if you believe a fair few have held off the market because of the budget, will they go on before the end of the year? Boxing Day, for example. Or will 2024 stay as the listings winner for the past decade? It's going to end up being too close to call. Price reductions in week 45, 16,700, so a shift downwards. Estate agents know that price reductions at this time of year are not that effective, so they try a lot less hard, in my view, and get their powder dry for December/early January reductions with the glut of new stock that will hit the market. October's completed number, 12.8% of existing stock reduced, compared to September's number, 14.1 for reductions. August's 11.1 still looked like a summer anomaly, but the numbers came back 14.1 in July, 14 in June. Last year was 12.1. May was 13.4. The 5-year average is only 10.7, but the 5-year average is a little bit biased by how much of a hot market we had, 2020, 2021, beginning of 22. 2025's average is 13.2. A bit of a reversal of what I've been saying for most of this year. There's actually less stock being listed now, and then there's fewer reductions. So this market is heading back more towards normalisation. But what still holds true, and will for a while yet, because there's still more stock and there have been more reductions, absolutely and relatively. 23% more reductions than 5-year average. That's the difference between 13.2 and 10.7. 25% more reduced properties than a normal market. Sounds like a fairly good ready reckoner. 22,900 homes sold subject to contract. Now that's healthy enough, and unusually it was up on the weeks before's figure. Pretty rare for this time of year. 2025 average 26,000, but week 45's on average print 22,900. So almost exactly smack on that average number for the 9 years. Sold subjects up 3.8% year on year, still 12.3% up on 2017 to 19, and will stay ahead of 2022. Now we've passed the day of the lettuce and the aftermath territory. We're comfortably in that now, aren't we? And Sunak was in charge of the tiller by now, 3 years back. Sold subjects up 3.8, but listings only 1.1, remember? So a lot more intention to transact than 12 months ago, or a more functional year than 2024, even though stock numbers have been rising. We've had that stamp duty cliff as well. When will the market get a chance to have a normal year? Perhaps that will be 2026. Let's see if I come to regret those words. It's still the second best year for 9 years behind 2021 for gross sales. Week 45 was a bit more buoyant, but considerably better than week 45 of 2023 and of 2022. Second place for the decade in terms of gross sales will be safe, in my view, for 2025. There's one real anomaly as well that I really wanted to point out, because the market is really distorted at this moment on this specific matter. The price of a listing versus the price of a sale agreed. It really does seem now that only cheap, in inverted commas, stuff is being listed in the run-up to the budget. Average asking price of the listings in week 45, 387k. Average price of the sold subjects, 363k. A difference of 6.5%. So what? Well, the 9-year average is between 16 and 17%. So this is a seismic drop. I do expect that whenever there is clarity after the budget, and remember these figures run a week in arrears, will that happen straight away? I don't really feel like it will. Some people think there'll be a little glut of listings, a little spike of listings after the budget on the 26th. I'm not so convinced myself. I think it'd be more the latter, Boxing Day / early January. But let's see. What was the number of the average price of a listed house on the portals in September? Well, it was 452k. October, 415k. I remember now 387k in week 45. It's dropped like a stone. It's always higher in September as the expensive houses go on the market after the summer holiday divorces Well, all right, I made the divorce bit up, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was the reason for a few of them. We went into November with 742,072 homes on the market, whereas October's number was 751,797. So a month-to-month drop of nearly 10,000. The numbers look like a slowish October for net listings, but nothing extraordinary. We aren't back to the peak of the 763,000 we had on the market at the beginning of August this year, and it really does look like that 763k is our cycle peak for number of houses on the market. And for a bit of context there, as the market got stickier before the pandemic, that number was 660,000. Sellers market is more likely to be under 600,000 if you're looking at it from a supply perspective. At the end of October 2024, there was 725,000 on the market. Ongoing figures will be interesting as we don't watch the number of properties withdrawn from the market week on week. There were only 2.4% more properties on the market on November the 1st, 2025 compared to November the 1st, 2024. But that 2024 number was already the highest for 8 years, bear in mind. Chris also looks at the per square foot on sold subject to contract properties. October's sales agreed average was £343.18 per square foot. That was a huge leap on September's number, but I did check with Chris and he hasn't changed his methodology. So there we go. There was a big increase in the Halifax House Price Index. It wasn't quite that big. September had seen some pretty soft per square foot sales pricing agreed though at that time, and he also thinks this is due to the size of the properties that are being agreed. I had a little chat with him about it offline. So August was down to 338.78, but June is still the highest number this calendar year so far, and indeed all time, at £346.45. I saw Chris's numbers just before I came on this live for the last week, and the last week actually suggested 346 was the per square foot price of sales agreed in the last week, so we're there or thereabouts. But we've had a little drop still on June and July's numbers. It's not unnecessarily uncommon, especially in a fairly trappy, fairly flat market, and we know that this budget has damaged the economy, has damaged consumer confidence and business confidence, and it's stopped Britain moving ultimately, and something's got to change on this front, to be honest with you, but we'll get into that in a while. What about the fall throughs? We were back at 25.4%, 26.5% the week before, long-term average 24.2%, so nothing major there really. Net sales were stronger though, 17,100, 3.3% up on the last year to date, and 9.2% higher than the pre-pandemic. So we're well ahead of 2022 now, 35,000 net sales in front. So week 45, 9-year net sales average, 16,800. So we're also a little bit ahead of that. And I always give Chris this airtime, this weekly shout out, because he's much more prolific than just this epic tome that he releases weekly on the UK property market. He does great stats on a regular basis. You can follow him for free. He's got his article on the Property Industry Eye website. He's got tons of videos on his YouTube channel at Christopher Watkin. I also follow him on LinkedIn under the name Christopher Watkin as well. He produces an awful lot of stats and content, very much well worth following. And if you're in the industry and you want some support to become a more effective communicator or be more in touch with your local market, that's his core business, so give him a shout. Okay, what about this week's macro? Well, we're macro-clenching as a nation, adopting the national posture that applies as much to our wallets as it does to our glutes. We're collectively braced, friends. We had inflation figures, I'm sure you will have seen them. We've got to go there though. Rightmove asking prices, ONS private rents and house prices report as well. Little 2-for-1 for you there. And of course we have to look at the flash PMIs, especially those of us who are so concerned about the health of the economy at the moment. And you know what goes in the final slot? The gilts and the swaps, of course. So inflation gripping the nation since 2021. You may well have heard it here first. And if you're still around nearly 5 years after I first raised there was going to be a big inflation problem, reading or listening to this, well done. Those 5 years do seem to have gone fairly quickly, but also incredibly slowly, if you follow me. The carbon monoxide that is inflation continues on regardless, however. CPIH dipped under 4%, back to 3.8 from September's 4.1. Now remember, the ONS prefers CPIH and it includes housing. And CPIH has been trading above CPI because the cost of housing and associated household services has been higher than CPI in general, primarily represented by owner-occupier housing costs and also rents, of course. But all this substantiates the Bank of England's position that inflation has indeed seen the cycle's peak. Now, it's only been 1 month off the peak, so we don't want to get too carried away, but it does look like they might have called that one correctly. What was driving it? Well, the household and household services sector, that made the largest downward contribution, even though it is still going up above CPI, mostly because the Ofgem price cap change in October 25 was much smaller than the October 2024 change, which dropped out of the figures. That's what we call these base effects, right? OOH, the owner-occupier measure of housing, the synthetic one that I like, it also continued to wane, getting under 5% for the first time in over 2 years, printing only 4.8 only. The drop has been meteoric though since the start of this year and been very welcome for tenants, although everyone needs to remember this is just prices going up less quickly, not prices going down. A point that I seem to be obligated to make on a number of Labour's social media posts at the moment, when they're claiming that freezing prescription charges and freezing train fares will make the cost of living cheaper. It makes me worry they don't really understand inflation. I understand the more nuanced point in that people will get an index-linked benefits rise, or they will get a pay rise, hopefully, if they're lucky. That usually comes around April. But you don't make things cheaper just by not putting them up. You just don't make them more expensive, right? Let's be clear about that. Anyway, food made the headlines because it went the wrong way, back to 4.9% food inflation from 4.5. Core inflation also printed well, in that core CPIH was 3.7. And incredibly, that's the lowest core CPIH print since November 2021, 4 years. And core CPI printed 3.4, the lowest since December 2024. I still don't see this 2% world anytime quickly, but the 3% world at least looks though it is returning, and then we can go from there. Airfare prices were down as the larger rises of 2024 once again dropped out the figures, but fuel was up compared to October last in 2024 when it was down. Education steaming on at 7.6% inflation, significant monthly price rise. Once the VAT on private schools drops out of these figures, however, this will normalise somewhat. RPI printed 4.3 for those who still use RPI and have leases linked to RPI. Why am I still sceptical of this return to 2%? Well, we know that the council tax will be another 5% up next year. Mostly it was 4.7 across the country. As on average, most people endured a 5%, if not more. Some people went to the Secretary of State to get bigger rises. Energy costs look grim. January's price cap is higher than expected. The transmission cost alone, the increases before 2030 are absolutely eye-watering. 324% predicted rise in transmission costs for electricity in just 5 short years. Some elements of the budget will be inflationary, whereas an income tax rise, unpopular though it might have been, would at least have been disinflationary. But the path to 3% is clear, and perhaps even to 2.7 or so. But below that, I feel the entrenchment in the system is as strong as it has been for many years. Okay, Rightmove asking prices, and also the ONS private rents and house prices report. What are the key takeaways from the Rightmove report? Significant hesitation and a larger than average seasonal slowdown, they say. Of course the budget takes the blame, but the timing and delay deserve critique, of course. Average asking prices, as reported by Mr. Watkin, down 1.8% to 364,833, according to Rightmove. The largest November drop since 2012, for context. They also cite there's a decade-high number of homes for sale, although they haven't made the points that I have around how close it is to the 2024 market at the same time of year. And we do know from our weekly analysis that we follow very closely that it's reversing at this point. Specific uncertainty mentioned? Well, mansion tax, of course, and concerns over CGT. Not as bad as last year, but those lucky enough to pay CGT certainly don't trust Rachel Reeves not to touch it. And even stamp duty land tax. Again, no leaks there on that front, but not impossible. Scotland has 8% additional land and buildings transaction tax, remember. Agreed sales for homes over £2 million, the accepted threshold in most of the sensible commentary for mansions, down 13% year on year. 500k to 2 million, the nice problem to have bracket, down 8% in volume. Under 500 grand, a 4% drop in sales. But compared to the point where the budget was done last year and people kept calm and carried on. So we're not comparing apples with apples there. Or you'd need another strata below that and look at homes under 250 or under 300k. And that would show you just how healthy that part of the market is right now. But Rightmove note underlying stability and the 4% increase in sales agreed compared to 2024. Improved affordability provides the foundation for recovery. I would agree with that. They expect a busy period before Christmas, potentially, once the dreaded budget is out of the way. I personally think it's just a little bit late for 2025, but there will be some rubber bands that will go off when this budget is finally delivered. Either way, I think we're going to see a very robust start to 2026. Asking prices were down 0.5% year on year in entirety. 34% of stock on Rightmove has been reduced. The average size of price reduction is 7%. Both of those are the highest since February 2024, when we were coming out of a very tough market then, if you recall. Average stock per agent is at 64, up from 56 in January, so there is more competition and more need to reduce to attract the bargain hunting buyers. The 10-year average slowdown for November is 1.1%, which gives you a little bit of context for that 1.8. Are the sellers reacting? Well, we know they are with their asking price drops, of course. Supply in the £2 million plus sector is also down 9%. But strangely, first-time buyer pricing is down 0.1% year on year on asking prices. Second stepper is up 0.1, and top of the ladder pricing is up 0.7. Then again, you can ask what you like. You still have to get it, of course. Rightmove always likes to highlight the drop in the 2-year mortgage rates, down from 5.06 to 4.41 on average when compared to 12 months ago. Lenders are still climbing over each other to offer headline-grabbing rates. Monthly cost analysis is also showing that a mortgage payment for a first-time buyer with a 10% deposit has dipped below the average monthly rent for a similar property. You still need your 10% deposit, of course, and all the insurances and the maintenance, remember. As you can tell, that comparison infuriates me quite a lot. Scotland is still pressing ahead very well, with properties still taking far fewer days to find a buyer than the rest of the UK. Northwest asking prices have pressed on year, though, up 1.9%. And ahead of everywhere, with the West Midlands in second place. London asking prices are down 2.1 year on year, and at a borough level, Westminster asking prices are down 10.5%, with Kensington and Chelsea second at minus 4.6% on their asking prices. But the commentary includes a suggestion of a market of two halves, very much of an analogy I've used myself over the recent months. Prime Central has needs-based buyers only in terms of activity, is how they put it. Colleen Babcock, the Rightmove resident expert, focuses on the probable December base rate cut and suggests this could be the platform for a positive start to 2026, and I'm inclined to agree. To the ONS report then. Remember, rent data is 1 month laggedly, price data is 2 months laggedly, as if we needed any more confusion from the ONS. Rent was only up 5%, but it's very much coming back to where wage increases have been. There was a drop from 5.5% for September. So the average annual house price, according to the ONS for September, £272,000, with a 2.6% annual growth rate. But last month's report, it was a 3.1% rate. So a bit of a slowdown there as well, which is what we saw in all the other numbers for September as it goes. The North East continues to dominate the ONS figures for fastest rent growth at 8.9, and the Yorkshire anomaly persists, still only up 3.8 year on year. London had its 11th consecutive month of slowing rent growth, but was still up 4.3 year on year. On the sales side, Yorks and the Humber turn things on their heads. They're up 4.5% year on year, whereas London now is officially down year on year, 1.8%. Average rent is now £1,360 in the UK, and so that 5% over the past 12 months that's gone on represents 65 quid. The 5% is the lowest rent inflation rate recorded since August 2022, before inflation really took off, nearly 3.5 years. Scotland, post-rent cap massive hikes, now suddenly remains sensible again at 3.4% year on year. The 2.6% figure for UK housing masks a tougher market in England, only up 2%. Northern Ireland is still leading the pack at 7.1%, but Scotland looks more than healthy, 5.3% up capital growth-wise year on year. But we can only conclude really that the North, or in reality the cheaper stock, continues to hold a competitive advantage over the South at this time. There is very little investment-grade stock in the South, and so all the demand has migrated to the North and the Midlands, keeping prices buoyant and transaction volumes up. Right, yields are still increasing then as far as it goes. Good news for all involved. Inevitable with the normalisation of interest rates as well. How long will that last? Well, that's the killer question, but I'd expect it to last another 12 months at least. Onwards with the PMIs and a summary of all the relevant S&P global reports in the past week to 10 days. So where are the figures on the PMIs? Well, near stagnant for November on the composite, 50.5 down from 52.2 for October. The deteriorating metrics have also tended to print even worse, so this might be below the 50 handle when it gets finalised in early December. Why? Well, services fell to the same number, a 7-month low, 50.5. Chris Williamson, the chief business economist, notes that this is consistent with 0.1% growth for Q4 and 0% growth for the month of November. Manufacturing was a bright spot though, because it printed a 14-month high of 50.2. And yes, 50.2 is a 14-month high, and that's the sad state manufacturing has been in since the last budget. But a print above the 50 handle will be most welcomed. Why did it happen? A boost in domestic sales and a pickup in sales from Asia Pacific and from the Middle East. There was a decline in new work in the service sector for the first time since July. And why? Well, the budget and client caution. No surprise, no worthwhile pushback. What did we learn from the other reports, including confidence, jobs, and the global UK-focused business outlook? Cost pressures are persistent, I know. Plus 70% on a balance figure of firms. That's like the RICS balance, remember? So that would mean that 85 out of 100 said things would go up. 15% would have said sideways or down in terms of staff costs. I wonder what those 15% are doing. Perhaps they're implementing a lot of AI apart from anything else. But expectations for non-staff input costs also hit their highest level for 3 years as well. 56% plus 56 on the balance. However, as of right now, firms are cutting prices to win sales and service sector charge inflation eased considerably, whilst manufacturers recorded an outright decline in factory gate prices for the first time since October 2023. But listen, margins are squeezed, and this is directly impacting profitability and also future investment. Profit gains are expected by just 5% plus 5 of firms on the balance figures. CapEx expectations are negative for the third survey in a row, minus 6% on the balance, and firms projected that overall they would spend less on R&D. Balance figure, minus 7%. There's more loosening in the labour market, according to the S&P reports. Failing demand for staff, a rapidly increasing supply of candidates congruent with unemployment, jumping 0.2% in 1 month, of course, from 4.8 to 5. What's the result? Weaker pay pressures and permanent staff placements falling again, although at the softest rate of decline for 15 months. Temporary billings expanded slightly for the first time since June 2024. However, private sector employment fell more quickly, according to the flash PMIs in November. So we'll see how that plays out in the job report next month. Candidate supply is surging at rates not seen since late 2020 thanks to redundancies and fewer available job opportunities. Demand fell at a historically market pace in October. How about consumer confidence? The indices were at a 4+ month low across the board. Labour market sentiment managed to remain above the 50 handle at 52.6. Everything else was sub 50, and the spending sentiment index printed 38.2, which is congruent with other headlines on this very subject in the past week. Why? Well, with the budget. Okay, we get it. Business leaders have emphasised the need for a confidence builder when the statement is finally out. I agree, but will we get that? Well, the grim warnings from the big dogs towards the Chancellor are clear. There cannot be a repeat of last year, and measures in the budget must stoke business investment. Do not deter it. There's positivity from the KPMG chief exec, however, who suggests that a budget that does build business confidence will be a catalyst for renewed hiring. Okay, that takes us to the gilts and swaps. How about the 5-year? Well, a week in decline in the yields before the budget in the end, even though there was a breakout attempt to the upside on Wednesday, those bond vigilantes we keep hearing about. We opened at 4.008% and closed at 3.967%. A simple 4 basis point decline. I've told you before how very, very much I love those boring weeks where we get a small basis point decline. Thursday's close 4.002, and that left the Thursday night swap close 3.65, still 35 basis points discount. 1 month ago, 3.617 on the 5-year swap, but 1 year ago, 3.954. How about the longs that we're keeping an eye on? Well, the 30-year opened at 5.378 and closed at 5.371. Again, an attempted upside breakout, but it was short-lived. But the yield curve is therefore about 3.5 basis points steeper than it was last week between 5 years and 30 years. But those really, really boring weeks, they really are my favourite kind. And that takes us to something else that's been boring everyone, I'm sure, recently, the deep dive and the budget. I did want to talk about something else, but we're on the hill and I felt like I've got to have one final go. It's all anyone is asking me about. I'm doing 3 different meetings this week about it, 2 of those via Zoom, and I'm going to do a budget live tomorrow on this main YouTube channel at Propenomix during the budget. And also, if you haven't seen it, I've released a new show this week collaborating with an old friend and master of media. We've called it Mortar and Margins for reasons that will be obvious. You can check that out on the channel as well. So what's cooking for us mere mortals then? How much is it going to hurt and where? Well, the pocket, of course, I mean. We've heard it all by now. It's a watershed moment. It's definitely Reeve's second budget. There's plenty who believe it will be her last. On Polymarket, there's an 18% chance, that's about 4 to 1 in UK odds speak, that she's gone by the end of the year. Starmer is 50-50 to make it beyond next June. I think he'll be gone if the vote in Wales and elsewhere is another reform quake, although Wales is going to be much tougher than just rolling over. Plaid Cymru are very much there to mop up, though, if indeed the nation of Wales has had enough of Labour. But this projected 20 billion to 40 billion black hole got a little bit better than expected a couple of weeks ago. The pledge to eat the frog and raise the income tax was dropped like a hot potato. The hole now looks like it's in the 20 billions, although many respected outlets are still running the 30 billion figure. Soon we'll know, because what's a few billion between friends? Well, actually it's the difference between ending the two-child benefit cap and not ending it, for example. But tongue-in-cheek there, of course. We've hit policy analysis paralysis if we focus on what I believe we can trust from the news outlets. Anticipation of tax changes is already distorting behaviour, and there's word of another landlord exodus. There's certainly been plenty of lead volume in these previous weeks. Why does it have to be done? Downgraded productivity, global economic headwinds, increased borrowing. We've seen it all this year. No action women are spiking gilts and something approaching a trust moment. It won't be happening. But the feeling is that the focus will be on wealth in general, but will that be in name or will it be actual wealth? Because the first rule of tax is that the fewer people you tax, the more those people are likely to change their behaviour. In this case, their geography. Will it be something like a tax on homes in band F and above, in which case the vast majority of what's raised would come from people in band F dwellings, not from the very most wealthy? And would they claim that politically as a wealth tax? Well, that's highly possible, and they have played the politics of envy a whole number of times in this parliament. They're certainly not above it. What about stamp duty? If it stays unreformed, could the rates go up on additional properties again, up from 5%? Well, I've said it already today. Yes, they could. It's very possible. An extra % or 2 on overseas buyers, extra 2% surcharge as well. Again, very possible. Could CGT come up to income tax levels? That one I really don't think so, because it would likely lower the CGT take as people took cover, waiting for a different administration to be elected before they sell assets. How about the extra council tax bans, this idea of H2, H3, H4? Again, it's very possible. Is it likely to raise that much money? Not really. They're talking about a targeted valuation now that will take place from 2027 on band F, G and H houses and above. I just don't know what's going to happen and what people need to know what the actual physical financial implication of all that will be. And this, of course, is what's clogged up the top end of the market in no uncertain terms. But it won't raise that much money. The word is around 600 million, which obviously is a huge amount of money to you and I, but nothing in the governmental scheme of things when you're trying to find 20 billion. There'll be some bad press as well, because there'll be some elderly people who live in some lovely unencumbered residences, but they don't have much in terms of income. They worked hard, they paid off their mortgage. It'll seem like they're being punished for that. And listen, I can already see the Telegraph articles, not that there'll necessarily be a lot of sympathy there. Then the income tax threshold being frozen for 2 more years, so that'll be 28, 29 and 29, 30. It started in 2022 by Mr. Sunak, and look, this is a penalty kick. It's going to raise 7.5 billion, roughly, something like that. The fiscal drag approach. We're not charging you more, but you are earning more, and so you pay a bit more. But, you're earning more, so there you go. But, of course, there's inflation to consider. You don't really see it. So my favourite analogy here is always the carbon monoxide for an analogy of inflation. It hurts, but you don't know why. Unless you do know, of course, because someone is maybe constantly telling you, like me. But there's people talking of secondary emergency budgets if the first one isn't sufficient. That's just more of vote of no confidence in Rachel Reeves than anything, but I don't think she's incompetent. She knows what she needs to do. It's one hell of a look round the back of the sofa with arms tied behind the back, thanks to the ridiculous and counterproductive manifesto pledges on tax that were made by the Labour Party pre-election. And there's been some speculation of a return on Help to Buy. I've had a tip-off that I've shared before a couple of weeks back that it is happening. However, a lot has changed in those past 2 weeks. But if nothing is done here to spur house building on, it makes even more of a mockery of the already unachievable 1.5 million homes target that was set. Will stamp duty relief come back for first-time buyers as well? Well, that's possible. Targeted support for first-time buyers has got a good chance. There's speculation out there that rates for the non-residential surcharge could go as high as 6%. So this is what you pay if you are a non-resident of the UK as the additional stamp. So it could go to 6 from 2. A lot of commentators have this at odds on. It would only raise £100 million if it went to 6%, and that's before the behaviour changes. You normally, as a real dart at the board, halve these things, so it probably only raise about 50 million. So it wouldn't move the needle, but it might score some political points. But what should overseas buyers do in that case, if you're an overseas buyer listening to this? Well, you'll end up buying existing property investment companies. Then you'll pay the stamp duty on the shares, which there won't be a non-residence charge on shares. Will they see that one coming in the Treasury? I doubt it, because they don't seem to understand these things very well. But what about the removal of the death uplift that's been talked about? CGT dies with you when you die, and then inheritance tax is paid. Is it possible that this might be passed on as well, so the beneficiaries would inherit the CGT liability as well, and then would still have the IHT to contend with? That would really seriously carve up some estates if they do that. It is possible and complex. We then also become, I believe, the only country in the Western world to charge capital gains tax and inheritance tax at the point of death, or at least carrying the one forward. I'm not 100% certain on that point, though, because I'm not a tax expert, obviously. But it would generate a bit of activity as well, because if CGT dies on death at the moment, it does change the fact that lots of people, the optimum strategy for them from a tax perspective is to hold it till death, because the CGT is so large, it actually outstrips what the inheritance tax might be, depending on the planning that's been done, depending on gearing that's been used, equity release, other clever methods like that. There is one survey pointing to 85% of landlords looking to sell having CGT fears as their primary driver. Now, I'm surprised at this, and I'm not sure how prominently the Renters' Rights Act, for example, was in those questions. Supply of rentals, though particularly in higher value areas, looks absolutely sure to continue to be squeezed, however. Mansion tax is scoring over 80% probability on my basic model for this budget. Feels like it's long odds on, but how does it manifest itself? Well, we'll see. Super tax is the monopoly feel to it. How about sorting the valuation problem out across the UK in that properties have not been revalued for council tax purposes since 1991? Well, it's a very low probability event across the board, I think under 10% likely, with commentary considering that sort of play political suicide. And I'd be inclined to agree. If you were going to do a revaluation, by the way, why not wait until AI can do it? Because within 2 years, I'd be stunned if you can't get accurate revaluations across the country very, very simply and quickly. But we'll see. Who thinks that's going to happen? How about if we broaden the IHT base, inheritance tax? Well, it's very possible. Increasing the thresholds to 10 or 12 years for potentially exempt transfers. Bit of a coin toss could happen. A lifetime cap on tax-free gifts. Most people get this wrong anyway, because they think that gifts attract tax now. They only incur tax if the gift involves the sale of an asset, a crystallisation event, as the tax people say. That would then incur CGT, capital gains tax, but not if the gift is cash. You can give away as much as you want. It's just there might be inheritance tax if you don't last 7 years. What about pension pot tinkering? Well, there's been a slew of headlines over the past week. The FT seem to think it is happening. Other publications seem equally convinced it isn't happening. We can be assured, though, that salary sacrifice is taking a haircut. Perhaps there'll be a cap of £2,000 a year or so. A nice stealthy little tax raise. Employers will pay their 15% national insurance, and the employee will pay their, as I've said before, should be got rid of, employee national insurance. But there we go. What about the exit tax? Well, I think it's odds against, but maybe one chance in 3 or one chance in 4 of it actually happening. But if there was to be an exit tax, it comes in overnight. There's no other way. If they aren't doing it, they better be very clear it will never be done by a Labour government. Otherwise, they're going to continue driving behaviour for people who are large taxpayers to get out of the UK before the next budget comes along in 2026. So does this all add up? And how about the giveaways? A promised reform to the business rate system, although Eurotunnel are lining up the lawyers on the back of it. The point being that the larger businesses can pay more and the smaller businesses pay less. But we need to see the maths play out of that. The two-child benefit cap looks very likely to give the noisy backbenchers something, at least. VAT of 5% on residential fuel bills could also do with going, but that's another £2.5 billion. There's no other way this government can get energy bills down. That much is painstakingly clear. The 3p a mile surcharge on full electric cars also looks highly likely. And that's just going to be the start of the pain for EV owners, I'm sure, because it's so easy to tweak that one upwards year by year. It would be better to remove the green levies into general taxation, although it would cost more, about double that, and it would need to come from somewhere, of course. but energy bills could go down £200 a year rather than about £90 a year from the removal of the 5% VAT. Or remove all of it from electricity and keep it on gas if you want to try and nudge this behaviour. What's the word on the street then? Well, the smorgasbord as it goes, or death by 1,000 cuts if you prefer, like you would prefer that. And how about national insurance just for property income in personal name? Well, that would be one more straw just to break the camel's back. Don't forget 94% of rental property at last count is still owned in personal names. By hitting the income, it hits even harder than Section 24, of course. Half, or plus or minus 5%, of landlords are unencumbered anyway, so it never affected them, Section 24. Would it raise much? 2 to 3 billion, depending on behaviour, if it was implemented at 8%, the current rate of Class 1 employee national insurance contributions at the basic rate. Hampton's estimated it would raise more like £1 billion because a swathe of incorporations would follow. And of course that's possible. But this isn't just Hamptons who are saying this, who obviously have got a dog in the fight here. The Resolution Foundation and the Institute for Fiscal Studies have suggested there would be similar changes in behaviour. Now I always come to the same conclusion here. The first level analysis never discusses what percentage might be passed on to the tenants in higher rent rises. Well, when Section 24 was implemented, it was suggested in analysis done that the tenants absorbed 100% of those costs within 2 to 3 years. But as always, this comes down to supply and demand and an inelastic price elasticity of demand in the rental sector. That means price can go up quite a lot, but demand doesn't go down very much at all. Bit like petrol for cars, oil-based stuff. The pass-through effect is likely to be highest in London and the South East, whereas it wouldn't be 100% of that in Wales or the North East, for example. But rents could rise by £17 to £35 a week if this were to happen, and that's on top of already planned rent rises. However, there's never the alternative. If it hadn't happened, what would rents then have done? Well, you can't prove it, of course. Is that the get-out clause for the government? Survey data, and I'm always sceptical about surveys of intention rather than measures of action. Case in point this week, immigration figures from the ONS, a revision that trebled the number of Brits leaving the country when they measured actions rather than survey data. Survey data points to the fact, though, that 40% of landlords would plan to sell a property if national insurance was introduced, and only 7% of respondents would continue buying. Now, the 7% continuing could all be 5 to 6 times bigger than the exiters, but that does seem to be a difficult leap of faith to make. The national insurance application, now that income tax rise has been ruled out, is looking like a 50 to 60% chance, folks, I'm afraid. And then one more consideration around inheritance tax before I leave you to your day and stop ruining it. Could taper relief be abolished altogether? So the 7-year rule is a complete cliff edge. So just to explain how that works at the moment, if you don't know, from year 3 after a potentially exempt transfer or a gift, it starts to taper down. So it goes from that horrible 40% to 32 to 24 to 16 to 8 to 0 after 7 years is up. But it could also just be 40% down to 0 after 7 years. That's another way to go about raising inheritance tax. Pensions might also see the employer paying national insurance on the contributions, whatever, as if the employer hasn't had enough pain to deal with over the last 12 months. But pension contributions currently cost the Treasury £50 billion a year in lost taxation. So you can see why they might want to try and take a slice out of that pie. Private jets will pay a higher air passenger duty. That will make sense. And it changes very little, I think, but it is political points for taxing the rich. Gambling duty changes should raise up to £3 billion, targeted on the fixed odds betting terminals. Very few will shed too many tears there, and there's obviously a large societal cost to those. There's also been recent talk of shadow austerity, paring even more away from the real terms growth in spending in government departments that don't have protected budgets like the NHS do. So they're going to maybe take that real terms growth down to 0.5% or maybe 1% a year. So our final comment is going to be on the cash ISA limit. It actually strikes me as a good idea to restrict this at the moment to disincentivise saving. We need growth as a nation, and for growth we need consumption to rise and confidence to be better. Now the latter is unlikely with this lot in charge because there's no inspiration, no boosterism and no positivity about the UK. But the former, the stick side of the equation, for growth, consumption to rise, so stop saving because you're not getting paid as much on your savings, well, that makes sense. It's a bit route one, it's a bit brute force. You can't force people to buy stocks, but if you cut the ISA allowance in half, and you'll soon see people saving the same amount but in a tax-paying account, probably, most likely, or a bit less because the incentive has come down. The word is it's going to come down to £12,000, not 10,000, but we'll find out. And of course, from tomorrow onwards, I won't need to speculate. We'll know what the answers are. I'll be here at midday on Wednesday the 26th doing a live, and what I'm sure I'll be doing, apart from trying not to swear, of course, because I'm live on YouTube, I will be keeping calm and carrying on. So as I draw this week to a close, that next property business workshop is filling up. We've turned our eyes to 2026. The tickets are available. We will start the year with a bang, discussing strategic planning and how to make the most out of the next 12 months with some of our own methods and takes on productivity and time management alongside systems and processes. The other half of the workshop is about the most common pain point in SME property businesses: accounts, bookkeeping, and group accounting. This is about measuring asset performance, not how to use zero, but how to make the most out of financial information. What should you be seeing monthly? How should you interpret it properly and use it strategically to grow your business safely but quickly? Super early bird tickets are currently available with a genuine 20% discount off the face value. As always, we have real life case studies about our own experiences, and we close with our no holds barred Q&A. Anything individual you'd like us to consider? Well, get yourself a VIP ticket, join us for dinner. It's a smaller setting with an opportunity to discuss specific roadblocks or issues within your property businesses at the moment. That is the very best way to get a substantial conversation with myself, Rod, and other experienced property business people. Join us on Thursday, the 22nd of January 2026 in central London. The link for the tickets is in the show notes, and it's at tinyurl.com/PBWNINE. But I must just encourage you one more time to please keep calm, always listen to or read the supplement and carry on. There will be opportunities abound this year and towards 2030 and beyond, and the landscape is set for a surefire bull run. It will be slowish, it will take a little while to get off the ground, and the amount of stock around is still just about keeping a lid on things at the moment, but as the market is continuing to improve slowly, it's a case of here we go, in my opinion. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.